The chamber was buried beneath the city like a secret the earth itself was sworn to keep. No windows, no clocks, no sound except the distant hum of ventilation and the quiet breathing of armed men stationed at the doors. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and gun oil. A single table stretched between them, dark and glossy, reflecting the cold white lights above like a frozen lake. She stared at her own reflection there for a moment and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her hands were trembling. The papers waited in front of her, perfectly aligned, the ink still sharp and wet from the printer. Divorce documents written in the careful language of the syndicate, every clause designed to sever bonds without leaving weakness behind. Marriage, in their world, was never just love. It was alliance, territory, blood. Ending it required signatures that felt heavier than vows. He sat across from her, unmoving. The man she had once known as gentle in private and terrifying in public now looked carved from stone. His suit was black, immaculate, his posture rigid with the discipline of a ruler who could not afford softness. There was no anger in his face, no pleading, no visible grief, only control. He had perfected that expression over the years, the mask that kept enemies guessing and allies obedient. She wondered if he even knew he was still wearing it here with her. He did not look at her hands shaking. He did not look at the faint sheen of tears in her eyes. He looked only at the documents, as if this were a transaction to finalize before his next war meeting. She pressed the pen to the paper. The first stroke felt like cutting through her own skin. 5 years of marriage dissolved into a signature that slanted unevenly because she could not steady her fingers. She felt him watching, not her pain, but the act itself. Efficiency, completion, closure. He believed she was choosing escape. He believed she was turning her back on loyalty, on the life they had built, on him. She believed he had already left her long ago, swallowed whole by violence and ambition, by the endless hunger of power that demanded everything and gave nothing back. She had waited nights that bled into mornings, dinners that went cold, anniversaries forgotten beneath piles of blood-stained money. Somewhere between his empire and her loneliness, love had suffocated quietly. The second signature blurred as her vision swam. The third ended it. The attorney murmured something formal, words that drifted past her like smoke. He signed without hesitation, his pen gliding across the paper with mechanical precision. A final stamp echoed in the chamber like a gunshot. Done. He stood immediately. No hesitation, no farewell. His chair slid back with a soft scrape. He adjusted his cuff as if preparing for another meeting, nodded once to the attorney, and walked toward the door. The guards opened it for him. He did not look back. The door sealed behind him with a muted click that felt louder than any explosion. The silence that followed crushed her chest. She stood too fast. The room tilted. A wave of nausea slammed into her, violent and sudden. She barely made it down the corridor before she was gripping the cold marble sink in the private bathroom, her breath ragged. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Her reflection looked ghost-pale, eyes wide with something that was not just grief. She knew this feeling. It had followed her for days. She had blamed stress, heartbreak, sleepless nights. But her hand moved instinctively to her stomach now, protective, trembling. The test was still in her purse. She had carried it like a confession she was too afraid to speak. Her fingers fumbled with the packaging. Minutes stretched into eternity. The bathroom felt smaller, the air thinner. When she looked down and saw the result, the world narrowed to two impossible lines. Life. Growing inside her. His child. A sound escaped her that was half sob, half laugh. Tears spilled freely now, hot and unstoppable. She pressed her forehead against the mirror and cradled her stomach with both hands. The chamber upstairs had ended a marriage. This room had begun a war inside her heart. A Mafia heir was not a blessing. It was a target. She saw the future with brutal clarity. Enemies who would hunt a child to wound the father. A boy raised among guns and blood, taught to rule before he learned to play. A life decided by violence before he took his first breath. No. Her tears slowed. Something inside her hardened, reshaping grief into resolve. The woman who had walked into the chamber was a wife begging to be seen. The woman staring back from the mirror was a mother. And a mother could disappear. That night, before the city finished exhaling its neon breath, a woman boarded a train under a false name. No guards, no escort, no farewell. Her phone lay shattered in a trash bin 3 blocks from the station. Her ring rested in the pocket of her coat, the metal warm from her skin. Behind her, the empire continued to breathe. Ahead of her, a child would live untouched by it. Love, she realized as the train pulled into darkness, had not died. It had been buried beneath power, and she would carry its last living piece far away, into a world where guns could not reach. She did not look back. The moment the train doors closed, and the city disappeared behind a wall of black glass, she did not allow herself to watch the skyline fade. If she looked back even once, she knew her resolve would fracture, and the child inside her would feel that hesitation like a tremor in the dark. She sat rigid in her seat with both hands folded over her stomach, the rhythm of the train hammering through her bones like a second heartbeat. Every vibration reminded her that she was carrying something fragile through a world built to crush fragile things. The name on her ticket was not hers. The passport in her coat pocket belonged to a woman who technically existed but had never lived. She had paid for that identity with the last of her settlement money and with the quiet help of a man who owed her husband a debt. She wondered if that favor would cost him his life when the syndicate discovered what she had done. The thought nearly made her stand up and run back into the night, but she forced herself to remain still. Mothers did not get to choose comfort. They chose survival. The town she arrived in smelled like salt and old wood. It was the kind of place people pass through without remembering. That was why she chose it. Anonymity was safer than beauty. She rented a room above a closed bookstore using cash and a smile that hurt her cheeks from holding it in place. The landlord never asked questions. People in forgotten towns rarely did. At night, she lay awake listening to the ocean grind against the rocks and imagined footsteps on the stairs outside her door. Every creak sounded like a soldier sent to drag her back. Every car engine outside made her pulse spike. Fear became a constant companion sitting at the edge of the bed watching her breathe. But beneath that fear, something else grew stronger. A promise. She spoke to the child in whispers that barely disturbed the air. You will not inherit his wars. You will inherit the sky. Weeks passed, and her body changed in ways she could no longer hide from herself. The sickness came in waves that bent her over the sink, while she bit her lip to keep from crying out. She worked small jobs at the docks, cataloging shipments and cleaning offices after dark, because invisibility required labor. The men there barely looked at her. She was grateful. Invisibility had never felt so protective. One evening, as she locked the back door of a warehouse, she felt eyes on her. Not imagined footsteps, not nerves, but a real gaze burning into her spine. She turned slowly. A man stood across the street beneath a broken street lamp. He did not move, did not speak. The wind lifted his coat, and for a second she saw the outline of a weapon. Her breath froze. The child inside her seemed to tighten with her fear. He walked, not fast, not slow, each step measured. She could feel him following without hearing him. The street stretched endlessly. The ocean roared louder. When she reached the stairs to her building, she did not look back. She climbed them with shaking legs and slammed the door behind her, then pressed her back against it, listening. Silence, complete and suffocating. Minutes crawled by, no footsteps, no knock, nothing. She slid to the floor and wrapped her arms around her stomach as tears burned her eyes. He had found her. Or someone had. The Empire had a long memory and a longer reach. Hiding was not enough. She had to disappear deeper. That night she burned the passport in the sink and watched the flames eat the false name. In the mirror above the smoke, her reflection looked different. Harder, sharper. She touched her stomach and felt a flicker inside her like a spark refusing to die. Fear did not own her anymore. Protection did. Somewhere far away, a Mafia boss believed his past was buried. He had no idea his future was breathing quietly in a dark room by the sea. And she would turn the entire world into a battlefield before she let anyone take that future from her. The sound of the sea trying to climb into the sky. The storm arrived the same night her labor did. The wind battered the small clinic like a fist against glass, and the lights flickered with every strike of lightning. She was alone except for a nurse who smelled faintly of antiseptic and cigarettes, and a doctor who kept glancing at the windows as if expecting them to shatter. Pain tore through her in waves that erased time. There was no past and no future, only the brutal present of her body opening, and the terrifying knowledge that every scream she swallowed carried a promise she could not break. This child would live. This child would never belong to the men who ruled in shadows. When the baby finally cried, the sound cut through the storm like a blade. Sharp, alive, undeniable. They placed him on her chest, and the world stilled. Even the thunder seemed to step back. He was warm and impossibly small, and yet the weight of him anchored her to existence in a way nothing else ever had. She searched his face with trembling fingers and felt her heart fracture open. The curve of his mouth, the dark thickness of his hair, the line of his brow were not random accidents. They were echoes of a man she had run from across cities and oceans. The bloodline had followed her anyway. She laughed through tears that would not stop and pulled him closer as if the world might try to reclaim him if she loosened her grip. The doctor asked for a name. Her mind raced through 1,000 false identities and landed on one that felt like a shield. Luca. She whispered it into his ear like a spell meant to protect him. Luca did not belong to the Empire. Luca belonged to the storm and the sea and the quiet town that would never know what hunted his shadow. She signed the birth papers with shaking hands using the new name she had crafted for herself, and watched the ink dry like a door sealing shut behind her old life. Days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and fragile wonder. Luca did not cry like other babies. He watched. His dark eyes tracked movement with an intensity that unsettled her. Sometimes he would stare at the door for long stretches as if expecting someone to enter. She told herself it was imagination, exhaustion, fear twisting ordinary moments into omens, but the feeling never left her. The sense that the world knew he existed and was already turning its gaze toward him. One afternoon, she stepped outside to hang laundry and found a car idling at the end of the street. Black glass, engine humming too softly to be local. Her breath caught. She felt Luca shift in her arms and a cold certainty slid into her veins. She turned her back to the street and walked inside without rushing, without signaling panic. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but running attracted attention. Stillness was survival. From the window, she watched the car remain for hours. No one exited. No one approached. It simply waited like a question she could not answer. That night, she packed a bag while Luca slept against her chest. She moved through the apartment in darkness, memorizing the shape of everything she was leaving behind. Each object felt like a betrayal, another life abandoned. But motherhood had stripped her of the luxury of attachment. When the car engine finally faded, she did not feel relief. She felt the ticking of a clock she could not see. Someone somewhere had begun searching. Maybe they had not found her yet, but they were close enough to cast a shadow. She held Luca tighter and whispered promises into his hair. "You are not prey. You are not a weapon. You are not their future. You are mine." The storm outside returned before dawn, and she slipped into it carrying her son and a bag filled with nothing but documents and fear, and a love so fierce it tasted like fire. Somewhere far away, a man who ruled an empire slept without knowing his heir was already learning how to disappear. And in the dark, she understood a truth that settled into her bones like iron. The child who should not exist would one day change everything. And the world was already beginning to feel him breathe. A tower of glass and steel that rose above the city like a blade frozen mid-strike. From the outside, it looked clean and modern and legitimate. Inside, it breathed like a living organism built from money, fear, and obedience. Men moved through the corridors without speaking. Elevators opened and closed with silent precision. Cameras watched every angle. At the very top floor, behind doors that required 3 layers of authentication, the ruler of this quiet empire stood alone in the dark, watching the city pulse beneath him. He did not turn on the lights anymore. He preferred the reflection of the skyline against the glass because it allowed him to stand half invisible even to himself. Power had made him large in the eyes of the world and hollow in the chambers of his chest. He measured time in transactions and funerals, in territory gained and rivals buried. The council called him unstoppable. Enemies called him a ghost. He called himself awake only when the night swallowed everything else. 9 years had passed since the woman vanished. He did not speak her name. Names had weight, and he refused to give hers the power to move the air around him. Yet she lived in the small fractures of his routine. The empty chair at the end of the dining table. The untouched side of the bed in the penthouse safe house he never bothered to redecorate. He kept her ring locked in a steel drawer beneath his desk, and sometimes in the middle of negotiations, his hand would drift toward it without his permission. He would stop himself every time. Sentiment was a weakness that men in his position did not survive. The council had begun whispering about succession. He heard it in the pauses between their words. An empire without an heir was an invitation for wolves. Rival families circled closer each year, waiting for the moment his strength showed a crack. They wanted a marriage alliance, a child that could anchor the bloodline. He dismissed them all with a look that froze the room. He would not build a future with a stranger while the past still walked beside him like a shadow that refused to fade. One evening, a digital analyst requested an urgent audience. The man entered shaking despite the climate-controlled air. A projection flickered onto the wall showing a grid of faces pulled from surveillance networks. Millions reduced to data. The analyst's voice trembled as he explained the anomaly. An algorithm designed to map lineage markers had found a match buried in civilian records. A child with genetic signatures that aligned with the boss's bloodline with impossible precision. The room tilted for a second, and he thought he misheard. He stepped closer to the screen. The boy's image filled the wall, dark eyes steady, expression calm beyond his years, a face that felt like a mirror dragged out of time. Something ancient and instinctive moved in his chest, recognition without logic. The council members who had followed the analyst into the room went silent. The air thickened with the scent of fear and opportunity. An air meant stability. It also meant vulnerability. He did not speak. He stared at the image until the rest of the world blurred. 9 years collapsed into a single unbearable thought. She had not escaped empty-handed. She had taken his future and hidden it from him. Rage rose hot and sharp, but beneath it was something colder and more dangerous. Hope. The analyst began to explain the child's location, but he cut him off with a single raised hand. The room obeyed the gesture instantly. He ordered the investigation sealed. No leaks. No council discussion. This was not politics, this was blood. When the room emptied, he remained alone with the glowing image. He reached out and touched the light where the boy's face hovered. His hand trembled. The armored ruler the city feared felt something crack open inside him. Not weakness, not mercy, something older. A claim written into bone. Somewhere in the quiet corners of the world, his heir was breathing without protection, without knowing the war already moving toward him. The empire had found its missing future, and the wolves would smell it soon. He turned off the projection, and the darkness rushed back in. For the first time in years, he felt fully awake. Not because of power, not because of territory, but because a child who should not exist had just redrawn the map of his life. And he knew with absolute certainty that whatever waited at the end of this path would demand more than blood. It would demand the man he used to be. A journey taken in silence and fury held so tightly, it became discipline. The road unfolded beneath his car like a confession he had waited 9 years to hear. No convoy followed him, no armed escort, no council approval. He drove alone because this was not an operation, it was a reckoning. Every mile stripped another layer of the ruler he had become and dragged forward the man who had once believed love could survive power. The town appeared at dawn small and unguarded, crouched between sea and cliffs, as if hiding from the world. He parked far from the center and watched the streets wake slowly, fishermen unloading crates, mothers pulling children close, shopkeepers lifting metal gates. Ordinary life untouched by the empire that fed on fear. His jaw tightened. This was where she had buried his blood and built a life without him. He saw them before they saw him. The woman moved with cautious grace, her shoulders always squared, her gaze always scanning. She was thinner now, harder but unmistakable. Grief had carved her into something sharper and stronger. The boy walked beside her, holding her hand, not clinging, not trailing, but matching her stride with an awareness that sent a shock through his chest. The child was calm, almost eerily so, his eyes dark, and assessing as if he understood the weight of silence. There was no doubt left in the world. This was his son. The truth struck deeper than rage, deeper than betrayal. It rewrote him. The boy stopped suddenly and looked directly at him across the street. Not curious, not afraid, just knowing. The woman followed the child's gaze and froze. Time folded inward. Recognition crashed over her face like a wave, and she stepped back instinctively, pulling the boy behind her as if shielding him with her own body. The years between them vanished, leaving only the raw nerve of what had been done and why. He crossed the street slowly, hands visible, movements controlled. because violence was the only language he had mastered, and he could not let it speak now. Her breath came fast, her eyes burning with a fear that was not for herself. She spoke first, her voice low, and shaking, telling him to leave, telling him this was not his world, not his place, not his right. The boy watched in silence, absorbing everything. The ruler in him wanted to claim to command to pull the child forward and wrap him in protection built from fire. The father in him wanted to kneel. He did neither. He told her quietly that the Empire knew that wolves were already moving, that hiding was no longer safety. Her anger flared sharp and bright, accusing him of bringing death to her doorstep, accusing him of proving her right. The boy stepped forward, then his small hand slipping free of hers, his gaze steady on the man who shared his blood. He asked who he was. The question shattered everything. The answer lodged in his throat, heavy with consequences. She shook her head, silently begging him not to speak, not yet. The boy sensed the tension and stepped back, but his eyes never left the man's face. A siren wailed in the distance, not close, but close enough. Instinct screamed that time was gone. He told her they were not safe here, that he could move them now before the scent grew stronger. She refused, fiercely stating she would rather die than raise her son inside his war. The boy flinched at the word die, and something inside him broke. He swore then, not as a ruler, not as a threat, but as a vow that the child would never be a pawn, that the Empire would bend or burn before it touched him. Footsteps echoed from the end of the street, shadows gathering. She saw them too, and the truth settled between them like a verdict. The world had found the child, and there would be no going back. He reached out not to claim, but to protect, and for the first time she did not pull away. The boy took his hand without fear. That single gesture sealed their fate. In that moment, 3 lives aligned against an empire that no longer belonged to itself. The algorithm had spoken, the blood had answered, and the unthinkable was no longer a secret. It was a beginning written in danger and love, and a future that would demand everything from them all. The sound of gunfire tearing the morning open before the sun had fully claimed the sky. The first shot cracked through the street like lightning striking stone, and every instinct he possessed ignited at once. He moved without thinking, his body turning into a shield between the boy and the direction of the threat. She grabbed the child at the same moment, pulling him low and running. The quiet town that had hidden them for years exploded into chaos as people screamed and scattered. Windows shattered. A car spun out as bullets chewed through metal. The wolves had arrived faster than he expected, and they were not here to negotiate. He dragged them into a narrow alley that smelled of salt and old trash, his hand locked around the boy's shoulder, guiding him with brutal precision. The child did not cry, did not panic. His breathing was fast but controlled, his eyes wide and absorbing everything. Pride and terror twisted together inside him. This was not a playground, this was inheritance unfolding in real time. She shoved a door open, and they burst into a storage room stacked with crates. He slammed the door behind them and pressed his back against it, listening to boots thunder past. Voices barked orders in accents he recognized instantly. A rival faction. This was not coincidence. Someone inside the Empire had sold the information. She turned on him, her face white with fury and fear, accusing him with her eyes before a word left her mouth. He shook his head, once sharp and absolute, telling her this was betrayal, not strategy. The boy clutched her coat, but his gaze stayed fixed on the door as if measuring how long it would hold. Another burst of gunfire rattled the walls, dust drifting down in slow motion. He pulled a weapon from inside his coat and checked the chamber with steady hands. The old world had found them, and it was hungry. They could not stay hidden. He knew it. The door would not protect them for long. He knelt in front of the boy, forcing himself to soften his voice, telling him to stay close to his mother and run when he said run, no matter what he heard. The child nodded, once his expression unreadable. She grabbed his arm, whispering that he would not leave them. The plea cut deeper than any bullet. He told her quietly that leaving was not abandonment, it was survival. Footsteps stopped outside the door. Silence pressed in thick and suffocating. The handle rattled. He moved first. The door exploded inward under his kick, and the hallway became a storm of sound and motion. He fired with ruthless accuracy, dropping the first attacker before the man understood what he faced. She pulled the boy behind stacked crates and screamed his name, but he was already inside the violence, carving a path through it. The world narrowed to angles and breath and recoil. Every enemy that fell was a promise kept. No one would touch his blood. No one would claim this child as leverage. More men poured in. Too many. He felt the shift instantly, the tide turning against them. She saw it too, and something changed in her. She picked up a fallen weapon with shaking hands and stepped into the line of fire beside him. Fear burned away, leaving only a mother defending her future. They fought back to back, moving as if they had never stopped knowing each other. Old instincts resurfaced, not as lovers, but as warriors bound by a child between them. A shot cracked and pain ripped through his side. The impact stole his breath, but he did not fall. She screamed, and the boy shouted for the first time, a raw sound that tore through the chaos. Rage flooded him hotter than the wound. He drove forward, clearing the doorway and grabbing them both, pulling them into the street where smoke curled and sirens wailed in the distance. His reinforcements were coming late, but coming. Black cars screamed around the corner, engines howling like predators answering a call. His men spilled out, forming a wall of steel around them. The attackers scattered, some falling, some vanishing into the maze of streets. The battle ended as suddenly as it began, leaving the town trembling in its aftermath. He swayed, blood soaking his shirt, but he kept his eyes on the boy, who stared back at him unblinking. There was no fear there, only recognition. The child understood now. This was the world his father ruled and the danger that had chased him since birth. She pressed her hands against the wound, her tears falling onto his skin, telling him not to die, not after finding them. He laughed weakly, telling her death had tried and failed many times before. But in her eyes, he saw the truth of what had just happened. The old life was gone. Hiding was over. The Empire had reached into their quiet world and shattered it beyond repair. He took the boy's hand and felt the small fingers grip his with absolute trust. In that moment, he knew the war ahead would not be fought for power or territory. It would be fought for this hand in his, for the right of this child to live without chains, and he would burn every throne he owned to win it. In a room where the air itself felt armed, the council chamber lay buried beneath the city like a heart made of stone, and every man seated at the circular table carried violence in his posture, the way other men carried breath. When he entered the room, conversation died instantly. Eyes tracked the blood still faintly visible beneath his clean shirt, where the wound had been stitched closed only hours earlier. They smelled weakness the way animals smelled rain, but none of them spoke it aloud. Fear had trained them better than honesty. She stood behind him with the boy beside her, guarded by two of his most loyal men. Bringing them into the chamber was an act of war and declaration in one breath. The boy's presence rewrote the geometry of power in the room. Whispers moved through the shadows like insects. An air alive, undeniable flesh and blood, not rumor, not algorithm. The future seated quietly at the edge of the old world. The child did not fidget, did not hide behind his mother. He watched the men watching him, and something ancient flickered in his eyes. Recognition without understanding. lineage waking in silence. The first counselor rose slowly, his voice smooth as oil, asking if the rumors were true, if the empire now had a successor. The question was polite, but the hunger beneath it showed teeth. He answered with a single word, yes, and the room shifted. Alliances recalculated in real time. Some faces brightened with relief, others tightened with concealed fury. An heir meant stability, but it also meant the end of ambitions carefully nurtured in darkness. The rival faction that had attacked them was already a ghost at the table, their empty chairs speaking louder than any accusation. Betrayal had a scent, and everyone smelled it. She stepped forward before he could speak again, her voice cutting through the chamber with a clarity that stunned them. She told them the child was not a weapon, not leverage, not a symbol to parade through their wars. He was a boy, and he would remain a boy. The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. Women did not address the council. Mothers did not set conditions. Yet none of the men laughed. Something in her stance warned them this was not a request. It was a line drawn in blood. A counselor to his left smiled thinly and suggested that heirs belonged to the empire, not to mothers. The words landed like a blade. He moved before the echo faded, his hand closing around the man's throat with terrifying calm. Chairs scraped back, guns half drawn, but no one fired. They knew better. He leaned close enough for the counselor to feel his breath and told him quietly that the empire existed to protect his blood, not consume it. The distinction hung in the air, sharp and final. When he released the man, the message remained, choking the room. The boy squeezed his hand, once a small grounding pressure that cut through the storm inside him. He looked down and saw no fear, only trust. The chamber faded for a second, replaced by the simple weight of that grip. This was the axis of everything now. Power bent around it or broke. He announced the restructuring of the empire without raising his voice. Violence would no longer be currency. Operations would shift toward legitimacy, protection, networks, legal fronts. Those who resisted could leave with their lives or stay without their power. The ultimatum rippled through the table like thunder contained inside glass. Some men saw salvation in the change, others saw the death of the world that had made them kings. But none of them saw hesitation in his eyes. The council understood then that the war was already decided. The heir had arrived, and with him a future that did not resemble the past. She stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his, and for the first time since the chamber filled with shadows, he felt steady. They were no longer fugitives hiding from an empire. They were rewriting it from the center. As they turned to leave, he heard the quiet click of loyalty settling into place behind them. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to feel the balance shift. The boy looked back once at the men seated in silence, his gaze lingering with a calm that unsettled even the oldest among them. In that look, they saw something they could not name. Not fear, not innocence, but inevitability. The child who should not exist had just claimed a throne without speaking a word, and the empire felt its spine bend toward him. Rain falling so hard it erased the edges of the world. The safe house sat on a cliff above the Black Sea, its windows dark, its walls thick enough to survive a small war, which was fortunate because a war was already climbing toward it. Lightning split the sky, and for a heartbeat the hillside lit up, revealing movement where there should have been none. Figures advancing in disciplined silence, not a reckless assault, a professional one. He saw them at the same moment. His security feed died, and the monitors bled into static. Inside the house, the lights flickered. Generators kicked in with a low growl. The boy looked up from the floor where he had been drawing, and his eyes met his father's without panic. He knew the sound of danger now the way other children knew thunder. She stepped in front of him instinctively, her body already shaped into a shield. No words passed between the adults. They did not need them. They had been walking toward this moment since the day he found them. The first explosion shook the foundation. Dust rained from the ceiling. Glass shattered somewhere deep in the house. Alarms screamed to life too late to matter. The perimeter was already broken. He grabbed a weapon and pressed it into her hands, not as instruction, but as trust. She nodded once, her jaw tight. The boy stood between them, small and silent, watching the air tremble. He did not cry. The absence of fear in him was more terrifying than any scream. Footsteps pounded through the lower level. Voices echoed up the stairwell. The enemy was inside. He pushed them toward the back corridor where an escape tunnel cut through the rock toward the sea. Every step felt heavier than the last because retreat tasted like surrender, but survival demanded it. The hallway lights burst one by one, plunging them into strobing darkness. Shadows leapt across the walls like living things. Gunfire erupted behind them, sharp and relentless. His men were dying to buy them seconds. She stumbled, and he caught her without breaking stride. The boy clung to his coat, his fingers digging in with desperate strength. The tunnel door appeared ahead, a slab of steel slick with condensation. He slammed his hand against the panel, and it hissed open, revealing blackness that smelled of salt and cold stone. Another explosion tore through the house, and the blast wave knocked them forward. Pain rang in his ears, but he kept moving, dragging them into the tunnel as the door sealed behind them. The world narrowed to breath and footsteps and the distant roar of the sea. The tunnel sloped downward, slick beneath their boots. Water dripped from the ceiling, tapping a rhythm that matched the hammering in his chest. She was crying now, but the sound was silent tears falling without voice because the boy could not see her break. He felt it in the way her hand trembled in his. The enemy would not stop. They would follow through hell itself for the air. A shape emerged ahead at the tunnel mouth, silhouetted by lightning. A man blocking the exit, weapon raised. Betrayal again. Someone had sold the location. The gun fired, and the bullet screamed past his ear, shattering stone. He shoved the boy behind him and returned fire. The tunnel exploded with sound. The traitor fell, but not before firing again. She gasped and collapsed against the wall, blood blooming dark across her side. Time fractured. The boy screamed her name, and the sound ripped through him deeper than any wound. He dropped to his knees, pressing his hands against her injury, feeling the warmth of her life spilling between his fingers. Her eyes were wide, but steady, locked onto his with a clarity that burned. She told him to move, to save the child, to not let this be the end. He shook his head, refusing the logic of sacrifice, but she gripped his wrist with surprising strength and forced the truth into him. The Empire could rebuild a throne, but it could not rebuild a son. The tunnel trembled as more footsteps approached. He lifted the boy with one arm and pulled her up with the other, ignoring the blood soaking his clothes. They stumbled out into the storm, the sea raging below like a living beast. A boat waited at the base of the cliff, its engine already screaming. His last loyal men waved them forward, firing into the darkness behind. He half carried her down the slick path, every step a prayer he did not believe in. As they reached the boat, she sagged against him, her strength fading. The boy clung to her, crying openly, now his small hands stained red. He pushed them onto the deck and turned to face the cliff where silhouettes gathered against the lightning. The old world stood there, armed and furious, demanding its heir. He raised his weapon and fired until the figures scattered and the boat tore away from the shore. The safe house burned behind them, flames climbing into the rain. He held her, and the boy, as the distance widened, feeling the empire crack beneath the weight of what it had tried to destroy. This was no longer a struggle for power. It was a war for a future that refused to die. And as the storm swallowed the coast, he understood with terrible certainty that the world they had known was already ashes drifting behind them. What remained was only the three of them and the fire they carried forward. In a silence so complete it felt artificial, like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see who survived the night. Dawn rose slowly over a foreign harbor where the boat finally stopped its engine and drifted into fog. The sea was calm here, deceptively gentle, as if it had never witnessed the violence they carried across it. He stepped onto the dock with the boy in his arms, and her weight pressed against his side, her blood drying into his clothes like a brand he would never scrub away. Every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion, but he did not feel it. The only thing that existed was the fragile rhythm of her breathing and the small heartbeat thundering against his chest. A medic waited in the shadows, one of the few men left he trusted without reservation. They laid her on a crate, and the man worked in silence, hands steady, eyes focused. The boy stood frozen, watching every movement, his face pale, but dry now, as if tears belonged to a version of him that no longer existed. Childhood had ended somewhere in the tunnel. He reached for the boy and pulled him close, whispering that she would live, that this was not where their story ended. He did not know if it was true, but truth had become secondary to faith. The boy nodded, once absorbing the words like an oath. When the medic finished, he looked up and gave a single sharp nod. Alive. The tension inside him loosened just enough for air to return to his lungs. He sank onto the dock beside her, brushing wet hair from her face. She opened her eyes slowly, confusion flickering before recognition settled. Her hand found his and tightened weakly. No accusations, no fear, only relief. The boy collapsed beside her, wrapping his arms around both of them, and in that moment, the world narrowed to a circle of survival. They were still here. The Empire had failed to erase them. But survival was not victory. He knew that with a clarity that cut deeper than any wound. The attack had not been desperation, it had been strategy. Someone at the highest level had ordered it, and that meant the empire he built was no longer his. It was a machine turning against its own blood. He stood and looked out over the water as the fog thinned, revealing a skyline he did not recognize. Exile had come full circle. Now it was his turn to choose disappearance or domination. He chose war. Not the war of territory and money he once ruled with cold precision, but a war of dismantling. He called the remaining loyalists, and his voice carried a calm that frightened even them. Every violent operation was to cease immediately. Accounts were to be liquidated, fronts converted, assets redirected into protection networks. The empire would not die, it would transform, or it would burn. Those who resisted would be left outside its walls. There would be no negotiation. His words spread faster than gunfire through the underworld. Kings felt their thrones tilt. Mercenaries felt the ground vanish beneath their boots. The future was arriving, and it did not speak their language. She listened from the dock, her fingers still tangled with the boy's hair. She understood what he was doing before he finished the call. He was tearing down the world that created him, brick by bloody brick. Not for redemption, not for forgiveness, but for the child watching him with unwavering eyes. The boy stood and walked to his side, small hand slipping into his palm. The gesture anchored the decision into reality. This was no longer abstract. This was inheritance rewritten in real time. Sirens echoed faintly across the harbor, not for them, but for a city waking into chaos as the empire convulsed. He felt the old power stir in his veins, the instinct to command, to conquer. but it was tempered now by something stronger: purpose. He knelt in front of the boy and told him quietly that everything burning behind them was making room for a world he could live in without fear. The child studied his face and nodded as if accepting a contract written beyond language. She rose unsteadily and stepped beside them, her presence completing the shape of what they had become. Not fugitives, not rulers, but a family standing at the edge of a new order. The sun finally broke through the fog, painting the water in gold, and for the first time since the storm, he allowed himself to believe they might outrun the ghosts chasing them. The empire he built was collapsing, and in its place, something unthinkable was being born. Not peace, not yet, but the possibility of it. And as the light touched the boy's face, he understood that the war ahead was not about survival anymore. It was about making sure this child inherited a dawn instead of a battlefield. A truth that arrived quietly and split the world open without raising its voice. The harbor had emptied into morning light, and the chaos of the empire was now a distant storm carried on phones and whispers. Men were running, abandoning posts, changing loyalties, burning records to save themselves. He could feel the old structure collapsing like a building that had already accepted gravity. But inside the small warehouse where they hid, there was a stillness that felt sacred. She sat on a crate, watching the boy's sleep curled against her side, and something in her expression told him the war outside was not the only battle reaching its end. She asked him to sit, and the tone of her voice pulled him down beside her without question. Her fingers traced the boy's hair with a tenderness that carried 9 years of exile inside it. She told him there was something he never knew, something she buried deeper than her name, deeper than the pregnancy, deeper than the fear. Her words were steady, but her eyes trembled. He felt a cold weight settle in his chest, the instinctive warning that the next sentence would redraw everything he thought he understood. She spoke of bloodlines older than the empire, older than the families that ruled the city like kings. A lineage whispered about in the underworld as myth. The founder's blood, a mark that appeared once in generations and then vanished, leaving only stories behind. Men believed it was cursed or blessed depending on who told the tale. Those born with it did not inherit power, they ended cycles. Empires that touched them transformed or collapsed. Violence could not root itself in their shadow for long. He almost laughed at the superstition until she looked at him with absolute certainty and told him the boy carried that mark. The air changed. Even the distant noise of the harbor seemed to step back. He stared at the child as if expecting to see something glowing beneath his skin. Nothing was visible, and yet everything felt different. Memories flashed through his mind, the way the boy watched without fear, the way men in the council had shifted under his gaze, the unnatural calm that followed him like a second atmosphere. Coincidence collapsed into pattern. The empire had begun unraveling the moment the child stepped into its center. Not because of strategy, not because of betrayal, but because his existence rejected the architecture of violence. She confessed she learned the truth during the pregnancy from an old midwife who recognized the signs in his heartbeat and blood. The woman begged her to disappear because men would kill for a child like that, or kill him to prevent what he represented. She ran not only from the empire, but from prophecy. She wanted her son to be ordinary, to grow without the weight of legend crushing his ribs. Her voice broke as she admitted she could never outrun what he was. Destiny had followed them across oceans and through gunfire until it stood in the room breathing beside them. The boy stirred and opened his eyes, looking between them with quiet awareness. Children should not understand words like destiny, but he listened as if he always had. He stood and walked to his father, placing his small hand over the wound in his side, where the bullet had torn through flesh. Warmth spread beneath his palm, not magic, not miracle, but a sensation of stillness that reached into his bones. The ache faded, the tremor in his muscles stilled. He looked down stunned, and the boy smiled, not proudly, not knowingly, but with the simple softness of a child offering comfort. In that moment, the last piece fell into place. The Empire had not found an heir. It had found its ending. Not destruction, but evolution forced by a life that refused to inherit its hatred. He felt no fear, only a clarity so sharp it hurt. The future was not a throne or a crown or territory painted in blood. It was this child standing between two broken adults and quietly healing what touched him. The wars behind them already felt distant, like echoes fading down a long corridor. She took his hand, and the boys at the same time closing the circle. Outside, the city roared as old powers collapsed and new structures fought to rise. Inside the warehouse, a family stood at the center of that storm untouched. He understood then that his task was no longer to rule or to conquer, but to guard this fragile force that would rewrite the world simply by existing. The boy leaned into him, warm and real and impossibly human, and he felt the last walls inside himself fall. The unthinkable was not that he had a hidden son or that an empire was dying. The unthinkable was that peace had entered his life wearing the face of a child and demanded to be protected with the same ferocity he once reserved for war. He lifted the boy into his arms and stepped into the light with her beside him, and for the first time in his life, power felt small compared to what he carried. The empire behind them was ending, but the world ahead was opening, and in that vast, uncertain space, he chose to walk forward unarmed except for love.